Okay, welcome to part two, the rise of political parties. Now we're going to talk about Washington's presidency. One of the things Washington's going to have to do relatively early on is he's going to have to show his ability to use the Constitution. Remember, that was one of the big problems under the Articles of Confederation, is that it was so weak that federal authority couldn't exert influence. That's why Shays' Rebellion was such a frightening prospect. You're going to have a similar thing happen under the Washington administration. It's going to put the Constitution to the test in 1791, known as the Whiskey Rebellion. On March 3rd, 1791, there is going to be a tax implemented on whiskey, on distilled spirits. It is a really large tax, right? Western frontier farmers are going to hate this new tax, right? There are going to be a lot of problems with this in western Pennsylvania. The farmers are going to protest, right? In response to this, on May 8, 1792, the government is going to lower the tax, but it does nothing to end the unrest. You're going to continue to have problems that grow here in western Pennsylvania. These farmers use the grains they grow, distill them into spirits. It's the most profitable thing for them to do with this, and now it's being heavily taxed, right? On July 15, 1794, two tax collectors, U.S. Marshals David Lennox and John Neville, will attempt to serve a subpoena to a distiller named William Miller outside of Pittsburgh. The men will be shot at. They will have to flee to David Lennox's house, and on July 17th, an angry mob of between 400 and 800 men will surround the household, right? Things are escalating out of control. And everybody's watching this closely. Everybody's remembering Shays' Rebellion, right? Can the federal government do something about this? Well, Washington acts decisively, but with the right amount of caution. He doesn't want to send and put a militia together, right, and send it into Pennsylvania and crush the rebellion, right, and brutally kill a bunch of people. He doesn't want that, right? He doesn't want the presidency, this new constitution, to be totalitarian, but at the same time, he has to be able to exert that federal authority. So, on August 7th, he issues a proclamation that demands that these rioters cease and desist, and that he is going to put together a militia, and that he is going to enter Pennsylvania to put down the rebellion, and that anybody, he gives them an out, anybody who has returned to their farms, as far as he's concerned, they were never rebelling in the first place, and all sins will be forgotten. But anybody who is still rebelling when this militia enters Pennsylvania will be apprehended. Okay. Then he starts putting his militia together. He calls up the militias for New Jersey, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, and puts together an army by federalizing the militias. This is something we still see today, right? He creates an army of 12,950 that he is personally going to lead into Pennsylvania. But he doesn't go right in. He waits until October 24th. He gives some time for these guys to size up the situation. And by the time his army does go into Pennsylvania, this rebellion is pretty much petered out. A lot of people have decided to take advantage of that amnesty that's offered to this. And ultimately, there will only be a handful of people charged and only 2 people convicted under the Whiskey Rebellion. But Washington will then pardon those 2 men. So ultimately, nobody's punished. The message here, though, was clear. The federal government can respond, and they can respond decisively with the use of force if necessary to maintain that promise of the Constitution. Now, while Washington's having this great success as far as maintaining the domestic tranquility, there's also dissent inside of his cabinet, right? Now, he pieces together a group of men to help him run this executive branch, right? Remember, he knows that this is too big of a job for one man. The 2 men that are going to be the main players on this are going to be Thomas Jefferson, who's his Secretary of State, first Secretary of State from Virginia, right? And his job, of course, as Secretary of State is to help coordinate all things having to do with foreign affairs. And his former aide-de-camp during the American Revolution, New Yorker Alexander Hamilton, who was the first Secretary of the Treasury. His job is to get this pretty much derailed American economy back on the tracks. Now, these two men ultimately would come at odds with each other. The things that they will be most adverse on are, first of all, fiscal policy, right? Hamilton's going to come up with a plan for how the government's going to operate fiscally, and it's going to run counter to what Thomas Jefferson should be done. Foreign policy, foreign affairs, right? They're on polar opposite ends when it comes to foreign affairs. Remember, that's Thomas Jefferson's area of expertise or responsibility. And then finally, constitutional interpretation. How do you actually interpret this new document we're using? Do you take a broad interpretation of it or a narrow one? Now, I did want to take a quick second to address the end of Washington's term, because one of the things that will happen at the end of his term is he's going to issue a farewell address that's often misinterpreted by historians and teachers and you name it, right? Aspects of this farewell address often talk about his call for isolationism and neutrality. If you read this farewell address, though, there's very little that's said on that, and it never calls for isolationism. And it's also very limited in when it discusses neutrality. When it discusses neutrality, it talks about neutrality insofar as staying out of foreign wars, but it does talk about maintaining trade relations and things like that. So it's very misinterpreted. The bulk of this document actually talks about Washington's concerns about the creation of political parties. He doesn't want them to be created. He sees them as destructive to democracy, right? That the formation of cabals will cause problems in this system. And as we'll see here, a lot of what he talks about turns out to be correct. Okay, so just to wrap up George Washington here. As a general, like I said, though he was not necessarily successful, had a lot of battlefield successes, he created an army and a national identity, right? He maintained an army through a series of very trying times. He maintained that mandate given to him by the Congress, don't let your army be destroyed, right? He won, though he didn't win many victories, he did win a very decisive one at Yorktown, right? He put down a conspiracy to conduct a military coup to overthrow the government and went on to help reimagine or reinvent that government under the U.S. Constitution. There he became the first president. There he created a financial system, a sound financial system for the government. We'll talk about that in some future lectures here. He crushed a rebellion. Right, he proved the promise of the Constitution to maintain domestic tranquility, right, providing for the common defense. He avoided war with England and with France. He secured the frontier, right, and he established numerous precedents, including the precedent of 2 terms only, and then you go away, right, a precedent that will maintain until finally that will be broken by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, right, in the election of 1940, and now we have a constitutional amendment that makes that precedent a standard for the inside the Constitution itself.